This is the City Hall in Toronto. It was designed by Viljo Revel, who was an architect from Finland. In fact, he won a worldwide design competition for it. And you have to admit, it still does turn heads. Anyway, I was one of the many, many people lucky enough to work on realizing Revel's dream. And translating a pretty wonderful concept like this into a building that actually worked wasn't easy. And one of the first things we had to contend with was, in fact, the wind.
You see, the two towers look a lot like aircraft wings standing up vertically. Was it possible for a high wind to make the towers take off? How much would they try to resist and twist? And there was another problem. The towers are closer together at one end than at the other. If the wind was coming through the wide gap, it could get trapped because there's only one way out, through the narrow gap. Well, if you've got a lot of wind coming in and only a narrow hole for it to go out through, there's only one thing that can happen. The wind has to speed up so that it can all get out.
The same thing happens when you put your thumb over the end of a hose. The water goes further because it's going faster, because the same amount of water is trying to get through a narrower gap. But something else is happening inside the hose at the same time. There's a pressure build-up on the walls of the hose, and the same sort of similar thing could happen with the wind on this building. Oh, sorry.
It was also possible that great whirlwinds would rise in the space between the towers. In fact, one cartoonist of the day speculated on what might happen to the saucer-shaped council chamber if the wind came up. But speculation is not necessarily true. So we put a model of the City Hall in a wind tunnel and measure the pressure on the walls as the wind direction and pressure were varied. We made some amazing discoveries. First, on parts of the sides of the towers, there would actually be negative pressure. You'd think the wind would always try to blow the windows in, but in fact, it could be trying to suck them out. The pressure could be low enough that if a window did give way, a lot of the loose bits and pieces inside could find themselves down at street level in a very big hurry. We also discovered that the building wanted to flap very badly in the wind, and that just like airplane wings, the towers wanted to twist. Now we had to find a way to stop all this from happening. If you visit Toronto, you'll be able to see the solution. These lovely curved ends to the towers give them a graceful appearance. They hide the main stairwells on the inside, so they have a good reason to be there. But if you take a tape measure and measure between the inside and the outside, you'll find a big difference. The walls here are more than 2 meters thick and are filled chock-a-block with steel reinforcing rods to make sure the towers stand tall and don't twist in a high wind. And don't think that just because Toronto City Hall has such an unusual shape, it needed wind tunnel testing. Wind is a factor in all building designs. Of course, that's something those of us who spend a lot of time downtown in cities know only too well. The wind whips around everywhere. As we've seen, that's because the narrow spaces created by the buildings force the wind to speed up and whip around unexpectedly. Now, the climate also puts other live loads on a building. Materials change shape depending on the temperature. The amount of shrinking and expansion can be substantial, so we have to let our structures move. That's why we have expansion joints in bridges, and yes, even in buildings. If we don't let the structure change shape as it changes temperature, it might actually buckle and even crumble. Here you can see the difference in this expansion joint on a bridge, in summer when it's tight, and winter when it's noticeably opened up.
The same sort of thing is true for buildings. Again, we had an unusual expansion and contraction problem here at the City Hall in Toronto. The lovely white marble on the exterior walls is more than just eye-catching. It was the whitest marble we could find. And the reason goes well beyond aesthetics. The white marble actually reflects the sunlight, and that serves to reduce the heating that the sunshine would otherwise cause. Because when we first looked at the design of the towers and the amount of expansion that could be caused by the sun, we found that if we weren't careful, each tower would try to expand sideways by as much as 3 inches. That's 10 centimetres. That's far too much for expansion joints in the building to handle. So we had to find other ways to control this. One additional way was to consider shaping the panel into scalloped curves. That means that at most sun angles, they actually cast shadows on themselves, thus reducing the heating effect of the sun. And finally, we mounted the panels on thick blocks of insulation, ironically in this case to keep the heat out, not in. And with all that, we were able to reduce the expansion and contraction down to an acceptable 1.5 inches. That's about 4 centimetres. And we allow for that expansion by building in spaces for the building to breathe into. There's an expansion joint down there.
We even have to take into account how a building settles on its foundations. Many buildings have some parts that are heavier than others. For example, this building is 24 stories high on the right, with a 10-story extension on the left. The higher part weighs more and may settle faster than the extension. So we have to put a sliding construction joint between them so that the two parts of the building can settle independently. And here's another simpler example that's probably in your own basement. The walls are pushing down with the whole weight of the house on them, but the basement floor is only pushing down with its own weight. So house builders put a sliding joint between the basement slab and the wall to stop the slab from cracking somewhere where you don't want it to. Some of the loads are very hard to predict because they can change so much, and because even a seemingly small load can have a devastating effect if we are not careful. For example, a small child could rise higher and higher on a swing, not by swinging harder, but by a series of small efforts made at the right time. Well, if we can do that on a swing, some forces can do it to a building. For instance, machinery that vibrates in a building can cause such problems. Even bells in towers. And there's the most unpredictable live load of all, the earthquake.
By now, you're probably ready to give up, but don't despair. I want to start with the premise that live loads only become problems if you don't think about them when you're designing a structure. Because when you do think about it, constraints like this sort of turn on the creative juices. I mean, there's nothing like a seeming obstacle to provoke you to find a way around it. Because in a way, creativity is a response to a need to overcome. You need a problem before you can create a solution. So, how on earth does any structure resist all these loads that are conspiring to make it fall down? Well, the simple answer is that the structure just pushes or pulls back. But how does it know by how much to push or pull? These children know. In a tug of war, when they pull harder, I pull harder. If they're about to be beaten, maybe they'll add another player. But how does the floor of a building know how much to push up by against a load? Not too little, not too much. Well, for the answer to that, join me next time. Okay, guys, let's try that again.